Welcome to Conversations Different, a podcast of the Santa Fe New Mexican, focusing on the interesting people, places, and issues of northern New Mexico, and occasionally beyond, as is the case this week when we consider the life and legacy of our 39th president, Jimmy Carter. The former governor of Georgia died late last year at the age of 100, ending a life of service, achievement, and faith. With us to discuss former President Carter is the New Mexican's monthly columnist, Randall Balmer. The John Phillips Chair in Religion at Dartmouth College, Balmer is also the author of Redeemer, The Life of Jimmy Carter. Welcome, Randall.
Good to be here, Inez. Good to see you again.
It is. It's been a while. Even though his death was expected, the man was 100. The news felt very sad. What was your reaction when you heard?
I was sad, certainly, and as you said, it was not unexpected. He's been kind of preparing for a while himself, and he's frequently expressed no fears whatsoever about moving on to another plane, I guess. I'm not sure he would say it that way, but that's what he was doing. But it was sad. It's a passing of an era. There's no question about that, and quite a remarkable man. He will be missed.
Yes. I was thinking about my senior year in college when he was running for re-election, or not seeing junior. I was the political reporter at the Texas Tech University Daily, and we went to Abilene to watch his sweep of Texas back when Democrats could win Texas. And it was one of those things, you knew he was losing at that point, but he was so upbeat and, a better speaker in person than I had expected. And then we came back, and then Tuesday, of course, Reagan had the landslide, and that was it for him.
Yeah. Very sad. What people forget, though, about that election is that going into that final weekend, he and Reagan were neck and neck in the polls. And what happened, first, everything that could have gone wrong during a presidency went wrong for Jimmy Carter. But the last straw was the election day in 1980 coincided with the one-year anniversary of the taking of the hostages in Iran. And so, of course, the media were playing up the anniversary going into Election Day. And over the weekend, his popularity just took a nosedive. And, as you know, he lost by a landslide, and history will record that he lost by a landslide. But going into that final weekend, it was a close election.
That is true. And I remember thinking that outside countries shouldn't be able to influence elections, which really Iran did. And now we're in the era of, Russian interference, this interference. So now it's just like in America, who knows who's going to be helping us out when we choose our leaders.
Right.
It seems to me kind of an interesting synchronicity, a coincidence, something that we lost Carter right when Donald Trump is entering his second term. I can't imagine two men or two presidents more different.
I can't either. As you remember, I'm sure, Jimmy Carter emerged out of political obscurity, really. He was a one-term governor of Georgia, and he promised that he would never knowingly lie to the American people. And again, it's important to put the historical context in place here. That is to say that Lyndon Johnson had lied about Vietnam, and Richard Nixon had lied about
Watergate and everything else that he could.
And so Jimmy Carter comes along, a Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher, an outsider outside of Washington, and he says, I'm not going to lie to you. And I remember, and I'm sure you do too, it was just kind of a jolt. A president who wouldn't lie to us? It was just a remarkable phenomenon. And I think what's remarkable is that no one has credibly accused Carter in his 4 years in office of reneging on that promise. He didn't lie to us, and in fact, he told us some pretty hard truths from time to time, particularly about energy policy and so forth. And then you contrast that with the first term of Donald Trump, and I'm sure you know the Washington Post has this fact checker feature, and they concluded, and they're pretty careful about this sort of thing. They concluded that in his 4 years in office, Donald Trump issued 30,573 false or misleading statements. So if you do the scorecard, 30,573 versus Jimmy Carter, 0. And if you want to add Barack Obama into that equation, they concluded that over 2 terms, 8 years in office, Barack Obama made 28 false or misleading statements. And then you put those numbers together, and it's really quite striking.
Yeah, I still can't get over that does not matter.
I agree. I don't understand it either. And I think historians will be trying to figure out the Trump phenomenon for decades to come.
Yeah.
If we make it that far.
I was going to say, if we still have historians.
I don't want to be apocalyptic here, but
no. My stepdad was a good Southern Methodist, and he was so strict about what a definition of a lie was. And I can remember telling a partial truth, and he would sit me down and he would say, "That's a lie." And I was like, "No, this part's true." And he would say, "No, you told a lie." And I always thought of that when Jimmy Carter was running and in office, because they had that same very straight-laced approach to this is how you tell the truth.
No, and it was part of his DNA, I think, as a Southern Baptist. His father was a deacon at First Baptist Church in Plains, Georgia. Jimmy Carter was born again and baptized in that same church, and then he had, of course, a religious experience following his first run for governor, which was unsuccessful, and that really, I think, charted the course for his entire life.
And one of the kind of strange twists of this whole presidential story is that Evangelicals helped elect Carter and Evangelicals helped elect Trump. And I find that unbelievable as well.
It is. It's difficult to understand, and again, I'm certainly willing to kind of walk through the history of this if you have a minute to talk about it. The 1970s was really quite a remarkable time for evangelicals and politics. First of all, the background is that for the middle decades of the 20th century, they were not organized politically. And I grew up, as you know, in this world, and I remember it very, very well. We were not involved in politics.
It was Caesar, and you left that to Caesar.
Well, exactly. And the other thing is that we expected that Jesus was going to come back to earth any time. So there was an apocalyptic dimension of it to it as well. And many of the people in my father's church, my father was an evangelical pastor for 40 years, were not even registered to vote in the early 1970s. So what happens is that in November of 1973, there's a remarkable meeting of evangelical theologians in Chicago at the YMCA Hotel on Wabash Street. And they hammer out a document called the Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern, which you can still find on the internet. And make sure you look for the 1973 version of that, Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern. It's a remarkable document because it seeks to reclaim the social ethic and the social reform impulses of 19th century evangelicals, who were very much concerned about the growing gap between the wealthy and not so wealthy. They were very concerned about the persistence of racial divisions in American society. They were concerned about the rampant militarism in American society. This, of course, was toward the end of the Vietnam War, so that gave that issue a special prominence. But they also reaffirmed evangelicalism's historic concern for women's equality, including voting rights in the 19th century, which was considered a radical idea at that time. So this Chicago Declaration that was issued and signed by these evangelical leaders. And then Jimmy Carter comes along in December of 1974, and he announces his candidacy for the Democratic nomination. And again, at that time, nobody was paying attention to it. But his campaign really relied on those particular issues. Now, when I asked Mr. Carter about that, he was not aware at the time about the Chicago Declaration, but he had no problem whatsoever in our final conversation, actually, identifying himself as a progressive evangelical. So the 1976 election takes place, and Carter, as you remember, was heading toward a landslide victory in 1976. And then the Playboy interview appeared.
Oh.
He talked about lusting after women other than his wife. Now, again, for evangelicals, that's an utterly unremarkable statement.
No, because they examine their conscience for actual sin. Yep.
Exactly. Well, but also, what did Jesus say in the Sermon on the Mount? Jesus said, "You've heard it said, you shall not kill. I tell you, if you hate your brother, it's as though you've killed him."
Yes.
The law says you should not commit adultery. I tell you, if you look on someone else with lust, it's as though you've committed adultery. So there's an utterly unremarkable statement. The press picked up on it, and I remember one of the editorial cartoons showed Jimmy Carter with a big toothy grin, looking at the Statue of Liberty in a state of undress.
Oh my goodness. Oh, that's.
And so, what he was headed toward a landslide and ended up, really neck and neck with Gerald Ford in 1976, and evangelicals split really pretty almost evenly in that election. So, and then I'm trying to get back to your question here. What happened? The standard narrative is that evangelicals became so morally outraged over the Roe v. Wade decision of 1973 that they organized politically against Jimmy Carter. And I've spent far too many years of my life researching that particular issue, and I can say without any fear of contradiction, Roe v. Wade had nothing to do with the mobilization of the initial mobilization of evangelical voters in the 1970s. It was instead a defense of racial segregation at places like Bob Jones University and various segregation academies, including Jerry Falwell's own segregation academy in Lynchburg, Virginia, which he had founded in 1967.
We'll come right back with that, and we'll take a quick break.
If you're thinking about a home improvement project, HomeWise can help with an affordable fixed-rate home improvement loan. Investing in your home with energy-efficient upgrades and water-conserving features is always a good idea. You can keep your home comfortable year-round, save money on your utility bills, and reduce your carbon footprint. We can provide the financing you need to go solar, replace your old drafty windows, update your heating cooling system, install a new tankless water heater, repair or replace your roof, and more. Get started on your home improvement project today. Call 505-983-9473 or visit us at homewise.org. Equal Housing Lender, NMLS number 188231.
We are back with Randall Balmer discussing the life of Jimmy Carter and the huge swing in evangelical support from helping elect Carter, a Democrat, to now being firmly in the Republican camp. And right before the break, you were talking about how much of the switch came not because of Roe v. Wade, but because basically white separatists.
Exactly. Jerry Falwell and others wanted to defend their tax-exempt status. That was the issue. And the issue was really money, I suppose you could say. But the IRS was coming after them on the basis of a court ruling saying that if you have a racially segregated institution, that is not, under the law, by definition, a charitable institution and is no longer entitled to tax-exempt status. And that is what got the attention of Jerry Falwell and other leaders in the 1970s. It had nothing to do with abortion. Abortion was considered a Catholic issue throughout the 1970s.
Wow. What's fascinating to me is how they have been able to play this long game. So, it's almost 50 years later, and they have a great election strategy. They've got Donald Trump back, who has none of the principles that supposedly evangelicals stand for, multiple married, adultery, children by different women, all of those different things. Yet he's their guy.
It's a bit of a puzzle, I have to say. I think, for me, 2016 was a little bit easier to explain than 2020. 2016, I think there were three reasons why evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. Not that it excuses them in many ways, but I think the first was Hillary Clinton. That is to say that Hillary Clinton had been so frequently vilified by evangelical
demon
leaders.
Forever.
He was, yeah, going back to the early 1990s. And I think, and I remember talking to even members of my own family, and they just couldn't fathom voting for Hillary Clinton. And I think that was one reason. The second reason, I think, is that evangelicals have long engaged in a rhetoric of victimization. That is, they always want to see themselves as the victim. Our values are under attack. We're under attack. And this has been, again, I grew up in this world, so I recognize it from my childhood. And I think Donald Trump comes along and he speaks the language, the vocabulary of victimization better than anyone I've ever heard in my lifetime.
It's always about him. Nobody suffers as much as Donald Trump.
Exactly. He's always the victim. But there was some way in which they kind of identified with that. And then, of course, he says, you guys are victims too, and I'm going to be your defender. So he's the strong leader type. But I think the third reason, and probably the one that is most damning, and it has to do with the response I gave to your earlier question, and that is racism. Yeah. And I think it's part of the DNA in the religious right. And I say that with reluctance because I don't believe that evangelicals on the whole are racist. I don't believe that's true. But this is a movement that got its start in racism, in a defense of racial segregation at these various evangelical institutions. And I think it's simply carried over. And frankly, the conduit, the link between the origins of the religious right and Donald Trump was Ronald Reagan.
Yes.
And Reagan got his start in politics in opposition to the Rumford Fair Housing Act in California, which sought to make housing available to people of color. He was an outspoken opponent of both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Throughout his political campaigns, he used the dog whistle terms about law and order and welfare queens and all that.
Yeah, they had gun control in California because the Black Panthers were armed.
Were armed, exactly. Yep. Exactly. And so that's the link. So I think, the three reasons in 2016, at least, Hillary Clinton herself, the rhetoric of victimization, and then the racism. And so 2024 comes along, you still have a suspicion of a female Democratic nominee. I think misogyny is very real, sadly, in evangelical circles. You still have the race issue because
she was a woman of color.
She was a woman of color. And again, you have the rhetoric of victimization, which Trump continues to deploy.
Yeah. And I was thinking about the arc of Jimmy Carter's life. He's a candidate of the New South. He's the best of that world that they've improved upon, changed. And 50 years later, it feels like the Old South is back. And the issues that Carter wanted to champion are fading.
Exactly. And I think, and this gives me an opportunity to say that I think one of the most underappreciated contributions of Jimmy Carter to American life, American political life, occurred on March 9th, 1976, when running for the Democratic nomination, he effectively ended the political career of one of the nation's most notorious segregationists by beating
Wallace
in the Florida primary. Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think Carter gets enough credit for that. That really finished Wallace's career, and Jimmy Carter did it, and he did it as you pointed out as a so-called New South Democrat. And again, as you point out as well, you have to wonder where we are now. I think we're probably back pretty much.
Yeah, one of the things I read in the different analyses of Carter's life is that victory, beating Wallace, meant that racism and racists were no longer welcome in the Democratic Party.
I think that's right. Yeah, and that really does open the door wide open for Nixon's so-called Southern strategy, all you have to do is look at a political map and see where the South is today, and it's red. I mean, not only for presidential elections, but also for the U.S. Senate and governorships. I guess the only exception these days is Kentucky.
North Carolina's governor now.
North Carolina, yes, you're right. Yeah. But in terms of the Senate, it's
No.
Georgia is an exception there. You've got 2 Democratic senators in Georgia, but otherwise, it's red.
Yeah. One of the things I think about Jimmy Carter as well is how when he left office, he was so unpopular. People were like, he was a terrible president, go away. We want to get rid of sweaters. We have to have Ronald Reagan. And then his post-presidency, everyone admires.
Yeah.
But now there's a little bit of reassessment of the actual presidency, that he did some amazing things legislatively. And I think even just his demeanor in the hostage crisis, he didn't kill anybody.
That's right.
And he got them all back.
You got them all back safely. Everybody was alive. Yes, absolutely. No, I think that's right, and that's just that's the way history runs, and that's I think it's a good thing. That is to say that every few years historians kind of look back and say, well, wait a minute, did we get this right the first time? And this is happening now with Jimmy Carter, and it began to happen. I'm glad to know before he died, and frankly I like to think that my book was part of that conversation, and I don't have any illusions that it changed the entire conversation. I don't believe that at all. But I tried to take another look at his life and his presidency. And if you look at what he accomplished, it was really quite remarkable. Richard Nixon began to open the doors to China, but it was Jimmy Carter who finally provided full diplomatic recognition to China. Jimmy Carter deregulated a number of industries, particularly transportation, the airlines, trucking, railroads, which led to lower prices and more competition for many Americans. Jimmy Carter also redirected American foreign policy toward an emphasis on human rights, angering a lot of our allies at the time because they had bad human rights records. But Jimmy Carter thought that was important. Jimmy Carter called attention to the energy crisis. He installed solar panels on the White House, which Reagan removed.
Yeah.
And I've talked to some energy policy people who say that if we had followed the roadmap that Jimmy Carter laid out in terms of energy, we'd be in a far, far different place today in terms of energy independence and dependence on the Middle East and so forth. It would look far different.
Right. And then we had the Camp David Accords.
Camp David Accords.
Yep.
Remarkable when you look at it. Jimmy Carter advanced the cause of peace in the Middle East more than any of his predecessors or, sadly, any of his successors. And that was an enduring disappointment to him, is that none of his successors, Republican or Democratic, advanced his initiatives in the Middle East. Yeah. And the other thing, just to follow up on your observation about his post-presidential career, in one of our conversations, I asked him about everything he had done and so forth, and tried to get an assessment. And he acknowledged that had he won a second term, that he probably would not have done many of the things that he did in his post-presidency. That is to say, in many ways, and I've referred to it this way and others as well, his post-presidency was his second term. Right. That is to say, this is, the remainder of his life is what gave him an opportunity to do the things that he might have done with the second presidency.
Wow.
Second term.
On that note, we'll take a quick break and be back in a moment with more Conversations Different.
This is Patrick Dorsey, publisher of the Santa Fe New Mexican. Looking to reach a wider audience and grow your business? For 175 years, the Santa Fe New Mexican has been the trusted voice of Santa Fe, with unmatched local reach in print and online. In addition to our long-standing, independent, family-owned newspaper, we have a full-fledged marketing team with the expertise to help you succeed in the 21st century. From traditional print to precision-targeted digital advertising, we have the tools to connect you with your ideal customers. Partner with us and see the results for yourself. Advertise with the Santa Fe New Mexican and unlock your business's full potential. Visit us at santaFeNewMexican.com/advertising or call us at 505-995-3852. Thank you.
are back with Randall Balmer, once again discussing Jimmy Carter. We taped this a few weeks before Donald Trump's inauguration, and we'll see it'll run in the next couple of weeks. And I'm thinking about the simplicity of Jimmy and Lillian walking and her plain coat, and kind of the Washington media making fun of her because she was too simple. If I remember right, didn't she wear a dress that she'd already worn before?
She did. I don't know if she'd worn it before, but I remember actually going to the Smithsonian and looking at an array of First Ladies' inaugural dresses, and all of these First Ladies had designer dresses, and it said with Carter's. I remember this very clearly with Rosalind Carter's dress that she had purchased it at a store in Plains, Georgia.
Oh. And I think at the time, people almost thought that was assumed, but it turned out that was who they were. They didn't care about the trappings of the world.
Well, and the other thing is you pointed out, you talk about the inauguration day, and again, I remember this very well, and I'm sure many others do also. That is, Jimmy Carter took the oath of office at the Capitol, of course, as presidents do, and then he and Rosalind walked down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House, hand in hand. And this was an important symbolic moment because of Richard Nixon and the so-called imperial presidency.
Yes.
And Carter wanted to break with that and show that he was not afraid, that he was a person of the people, and certainly Rosalind was as well. A very simple woman in many ways, although very bright and
tough. She was tough.
They both were.
Yeah, I guess he sold the presidential yacht, which I didn't even know we had a presidential yacht.
Yes, he did. The Sequoia, because he thought that was part of the trappings of an imperial presidency, and he didn't want any part of that. And the other thing is, more than symbolically, he put all of his assets into a blind trust so that his decisions as president wouldn't influence his own business interests. Now, imagine that.
No, I was going to say he wasn't using his hotels to rent it to Secret Service people to make millions of dollars while he's president.
Exactly.
Oh.
And it turned out that it didn't work out that well for Mr. Carter, because when he did return to Plains in January of 1981, he discovered that his assets had been handled very badly, and he was in debt. So he had a tough time recovering from that. And he was never a wealthy man, unlike most of our presidents.
And he didn't use his post-presidency to make a bunch of money either.
To sit on corporate boards and so forth, right?
Yeah.
No, Jimmy Carter was the real thing. He really was.
I think about his faith, and I mean, he still taught Sunday school. He read the Bible. It was powerful, but very basic in a way. And now it seems like we have a lot of people who talk about God, who talk about Jesus, and don't act on the faith. It's mere words, not action. And can we get back to reality, to a real person who believes?
Well, Jimmy Carter was certainly that. His faith was very important to him, and I remember I attended his Sunday school class in Plains, and he was the real deal. I mean, he just talked from the heart, very sincerely, and he prepared. By the way, he prepared those Sunday school lessons. It's not something he just showed up and just spoke off. He understood. He prepared for them. And what people forget, I think, is that even when he was president, I believe the number was 14 times he went down the street to First Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. and taught Sunday school. So even while president, he did that. And
he actually went to church.
He did.
He did. I mean, I remember Reagan hardly ever going because he said it was a big distraction, yet... Joe Biden manages to go to Mass. Jimmy Carter went to church. And yet the people who are the most religious are for the people who don't practice their religion to some degree. Yeah.
We're gonna take decades to sort this out, Inez, and I'm not sure that we'll get there in my lifetime.
How many times did you get to meet with President Carter when you were working on your book?
Good question. Not all that often, to be honest. He hadn't. When I started the project, first of all, I'd met him at Emory University before a larger event, and then a second time when I was a visiting professor at Emory University. And he organized a lunch, and then was there another time? Third or fourth time was in at Maranatha Baptist Church in Plains, and then after he taught Sunday school, and then I sat next to him and Mrs. Carter during church, and then we had a conversation after church, and then he took me to his home. I didn't go in his home, but took him to his house, where he went in and got a book for me to give to me. So, but the reason I didn't speak to him all that much, two reasons. First of all, a lot of the material that I used is already out there between the Presidential Library and stuff that he's written about himself. But also, when I started the project, his aides told me that his policy was not to speak to authors until they were almost completed with their project. That is to say, and I understand that, because, any Joe Schmo could come and say, "Hey, I'm writing a book about you, Mr. Carter. Help me write it."
He wanted to be done so that he knew it's going to come
Right.
out. Right. That makes sense.
Right. And that's what happened with him. So I didn't meet with him all that much, but he was very kind and gracious when we did, and answered all my questions, was never evasive. And
He continued not to lie.
continue not to lie. He's not an easy man to know in some ways. He's very guarded. I left my conversations with him persuaded that the only person he fully trusted was Rosalind. And so when she died in November of 2023, that was a real blow to him.
Oh, I can't. That love story is amazing. I got to go to the Carter Center a few years ago, and just seeing them together on their wedding day and everything. I mean, that's love, and
it's love, but it's not to say they didn't quarrel. There's a great story. When Jimmy Carter's father, Mr. Earl, as he was known in town, was dying, this was 1953. Jimmy Carter, the Carters were living in Schenectady, New York. He was stationed there at the time. And so he was given a leave to go back and be with his father. And this is a very important moment in his life, because in Jimmy Carter's life, because he's standing at the bedside of his father who's dying. And people from the community start to file into the bedside, to the hospital room, to pay their respects. And what he learns at that moment, that is the son, Jimmy, is that Mr. Earl, his father, had done these extraordinary acts of kindness very quietly to people in the community. So carrying somebody's mortgage when they fell on hard times financially, extending credit at the Carter store to people who were having a tough time, giving money to a family to buy new clothes so they could attend their daughter's graduation from high school and feel proud of themselves.
Right.
Just little tiny acts of kindness. And so what happens is that, Mr. Carter, Jimmy Carter, is witnessing this. And he goes back to Schenectady after his father's funeral. And he announces to Rosalind that, "I'm resigning my commission in the Navy. We're going to go back to Plains, Georgia, and I'm going to have try to have the sort of influence on the community that my father did." And Rosalind Carter was not amused by this. And apparently the long car trip from Schenectady, New York to Southwest Georgia transpired in almost total silence between these two very strong-willed individuals. And Rosalind liked the Navy life. She liked being a Navy wife, and she didn't want to go back to Plains. But of course, it all worked out.
It all worked out, and she became First Lady and an example for many of us. Well, thank you so much for your time, and I really enjoyed talking to you. This has been another Conversations Different. We'll be back next week.